Welcome to Making Waves, the podcast where we spotlight real projects at Kleinschmidt and the people who bring them to life. I'm Ben Carey, and in each episode, we go behind the scenes of a project, the challenges, the innovations, and the human stories that bring them to life. Today's guest is Jennifer Jones, professional engineer and our science technical director here at Kleinschmidt, and we'll be talking about a hydropower bypass siphon design. It's a really neat project. I'm excited to dive into it with Jenny. So with that, let's dive in and make some waves. Welcome, Jennifer. To start us off, I have to ask you, have you ever been on a podcast before?
Well, thanks, Ben. No, this is my first podcast.
Very cool. Well, that's the case with a few of our guests thus far. So we're really excited to have you participate in this new project that we're doing here at Kleinschmidt. Before we get into talking about the project, which I'm really excited to learn more about today, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your role here at Kleinschmidt, so how you ended up working here and how you ended up in the hydropower industry in general.
Yeah, well, I joined Kleinschmidt right out of college. I graduated from the University of Maine with a degree in civil environmental engineering and started right in with some hydraulic engineering. So I did a lot of dam breach modeling right from the get-go and kind of fell in love with that side of our business, doing a lot of dam breach modeling and inundation mapping to support those projects. And along the way, I also realized I have a keen interest in people management and
Yeah.
have kind of found a way to move into more of a management role where I get to help others develop and grow in their careers as well. So I went from more of the staff and project engineer to a section manager. And then about 5 years ago, I took on the technical director role, which was an also a unique challenge because I started overseeing our science division, which is not my technical background, but it's been really fun to learn and gives me an opportunity to work with another side of our business as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And full disclosure for everybody tuning in today, Jenny was actually involved with hiring me. So you're clearly an expert team builder when it comes to developing the H&H group. And then obviously now into the science world. So it's been very cool to see how your career arc has developed at Kleinschmidt. Looking back when you were in undergrad, what would you say drew you to the hydropower industry? Because it is a little bit of a niche one that when you first get into civil engineering, I don't think there's a ton of people that, right away want to get into hydropower, but how did you find yourself getting drawn into that?
Well, I don't know if it was necessarily the hydropower industry that pulled me in college,
Hmm.
although Kleinschmidt does have a hydraulics lab at the University of Maine. So
Okay.
before I even knew them, they were helping support my college career along with all the other UMaine alumni. But it was probably the connection I had with prior employees that worked at Kleinschmidt. So I knew a biologist that worked here at Kleinschmidt back in the, I think, early 2000s or late 1990. And so I became aware of the company more than necessarily the hydro industry.
Sure. Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
and that's really what brought me here to Kleinschmidt.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
then I got the opportunity to learn along the way.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I also just love, I think your career is so representative of one of the really cool aspects of Kleinschmidt, which is we obviously have our engineering and our science and our regulatory groups, as well as our support folks. But there's a lot of kind of cross pollination between those teams that we encourage. We try to avoid technical silos wherever we can. And the fact that we have an engineer that's now managing our science division from a technical director position is really cool. And I guess just want to give you a hat tip for making that jump because it's really cool to see how that's all come together. What would you say the favorite part of your job is at this point?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Um, Probably the best part is when we can realize success in a plan that we have put together.
Mm,
So a lot of my job is not necessarily simple tasks, get them done, check them off. It's having a vision, making a plan, and then having the patience and ability to let the plan work
sure.
and seeing it through. So when things start coming together and falling into place and those connections actually happen, that's, I think, when I have the most joy. So whether that's staff developing and creating a project deliverable that they couldn't have done a year ago and hearing about that, or it's seeing a relationship develop with a client and someone within our team, and that leading to a new project or something like that. Those are probably where the most joy comes from nowadays.
Yeah. Very, very cool. That's a great answer. Let's go ahead and transition to a couple of rapid fire get to know you type questions for those that are listening in. All right, just off the jump, would you rather work in a comfy office chair or in field boots?
Field boots.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Very reasonable. Probably depends on the time of year a little bit, maybe, but
Well, you didn't say they had to be uncomfy field boots. I can
yeah,
find
no, that's
comfortable
fair.
field boots.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's fair. What about do you prefer coffee before work or cold beverage after work?
Oh, coffee before work. If you
Okay.
had asked me before I had children, it would have probably been a cold beer or a cold beverage after work. But after
Yep.
having children, I enjoy coffee before work.
Yeah, yeah. Or maybe require coffee before
Yes.
work is the better label for that. What about would you rather live without electricity or without shoes?
Oh. Um, I would
Assuming you could still do your job.
Yeah, I would say probably without electricity because I have wandsy feet
Yeah.
and I like to have shoes. And I'm also a winter person, so I feel like that would be
You'd
hard
have
to enjoy my favorite time of year.
yeah, you'd have to get pretty tough feet to handle that.
Yeah.
What about cats or dogs?
Oh, dogs, hands
Okay.
down.
Yeah. I think we're 4 for 4 on that so far. So we need to get some cat people on the podcast here. But all right, awesome. Thank you for that. Let's go ahead and transition to talk about the project that we're going to discuss today. So if you could give us the big picture, what was this hydropower bypass siphon design project all about?
Yeah, so we were working with a client that was doing a unit upgrade at their facility, and it required them to shut down operations while they were doing this unit upgrade, but they still had to maintain a minimum flow passing the dam.
Hmm.
So they were trying to come up with different options to allow for this flow to pass. And in discussion with them, we came up with the idea of designing a siphon system to provide the minimum flow, which is 60 CFS,
Okay.
between two pipes, while the penstock and the units were dewatered and everything was shut down. And so that's really what the project was for, passing that
Okay.
minimum flow.
Y- Yeah, yeah. Okay, so passing minimum flow when the project's dewatered. I think that's a relatively common problem that a client who owns a dam might have. Periods of dewatering and needing to pass minimum flows. Was the need to pass minimum flows specifically tied to environmental constraints or more physical hydraulic constraints for the project?
It was tied more towards the environmental concerns, I believe it's in their FERC license that they had to maintain that amount to pass the flow.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know we're not getting into specifics in terms of dam owner or anything today, but generally within the US, where was this project located?
This is located in the state of New York.
Okay. Okay, cool. Did the location of the project kind of further complicate things in terms of the design and the project as a whole?
It does a little because New York experiences winter freezing temperatures, so that
Sure.
was one of the design implications that we had to consider. And then also really just the site constraints and the way that we were able to locate it at the project. We had to be cognizant of the release, the outlet of the siphon to make sure we weren't eroding the banks or anything like that.
Hmm.
So those were some of the considerations with the location of the project.
Yeah. Okay. And you already mentioned that this was a FERC regulated project, and then obviously there was an owner of the project. Were there any other key partners or stakeholders that were part of the design project?
Not in the design part. We did coordinate with the contractor during the construction of it as well, but it was a design bid build, not a design build project. So from the design perspective, we were working with the client mostly.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, that was a great overview of the project. Let's transition to talking about challenges and problem solving. So, obviously, every project has its challenges.
Mhm.
What were some of the biggest ones that you faced when working on this project?
Well, I'd say probably the first one was just the general idea of this siphon design was one that was relatively unique for this application of being
Hmm,
a long-term
sure.
solution because it's two very large I mean I think there were 3-foot pipes
Wow.
and a large amount of flow to be passing. And we were also at a site that this was a rather large stretch of pipe.
Hmm,
We had over 700 feet of pipe that we were using for this siphon. So
mm-hmm,
the scale of it was not just the small siphon. So
mm-hmm,
that was one that we worked through. The other that actually mm, was something different was the collaboration, or at least for me, I should say, was the collaboration with our mechanical engineers. So
okay.
I worked with Brett Hoffman a lot on sizing the system to account for the pumps and air valves and check valves that we needed. So there was a lot of collaboration with him to make sure that the project was working.
Mm-hmm,
Um, but it was interesting of the impacts of the valves on the hydraulics and really making sure we were talking and communicating the same things of specs and everything to get our calculations to work out correctly.
yeah.
Uh,
Had you ever been part of a siphon design prior to this, or was this your first introduction to that at Kleinschmidt?
this was my first project with that.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
there was some learning and but we had a great team, worked with also our senior TA, Paul Williams, to help check the design
Mhm.
as well.
This might be a little bit too specific, depending on how long the project ago was. But do you recall? I don't know a ton about siphons myself, but I do remember kind of, I guess, from school listening to or hearing about how sometimes when you have siphons and pump siphons, there can be some cavitation issues. Did you guys look into cavitation for this at all, or was that not part of the design constraints?
It was. We did have to look at that to check, and we had to also look at the initial lift and then make sure that we were able to maintain the flow within the siphon, and then had some air valves to help reduce that as well.
Oh,
But through the process, we kind of had some checks for head loss through the system to make sure we were going to be able to maintain the outflow that we were looking for.
got it. Okay. And for those listening who maybe aren't familiar with cavitation, it's the formation, growth, and rapid collapse of vapor bubbles in a liquid that occurs when the local pressure drops below the fluid's vapor pressure. And sometimes when you're working in pump systems or in siphons, that can be an issue that can cause damage to the pipes and failure of the system if it's not evaluated. So something that we often have to think about when we're doing closed conduit work like a siphon or whatnot. Um, Another follow up, I guess, I have for you on challenges. Were there any specific regulatory hurdles, maybe as it pertains to FERC, that you had to look into? I didn't know if the siphon caused some additional dam safety concerns or anything like that.
I don't remember anything specifically with the regulatory component, but it could have been that it had been resolved before I got into the design portion of the project.
Hmm.
Because I know there was discussion about it, but nothing that I was involved with at that time.
Gotcha. And was this a pretty kind of quick turn project where they needed to dewater in relatively short order, or did you have plenty of time for the schedule on this?
We had plenty of time. They were thoughtful of looking ahead, and I think that came with that regulatory work in advance of working to identify a schedule that would allow them to be compliant, where
Hmm.
they knew this wasn't an easy fix, that there was enough time to really work through it.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. What about in thinking back through kind of from start to finish on this project? Was there ever a moment where you kind of had to rethink your approach, or did it, go about pretty seamlessly from inception to completion?
I think there was a point when we started doing some of the initial calculations that we did have to reevaluate of, oh, is this going to work as is? So our initial configuration, we didn't have um any valves at the end of the project, and so we looked to see how we could regulate the flow, and so we did have to make some changes along the way, but I wouldn't say they were wholesale changes. I'd say they were more just collaboration and working to see how things needed to adjust. The other area was just talking through the inlet configuration. So they have the ability to draw down their reservoir elevation, and that has an impact of creating potential vortices if the water surface drops too low. So making sure that we've got the right starting elevation. Those were just kind of some design things that weren't major changes. They were just things that we worked through in the process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like a really cool team effort on that. Let's talk a little bit more about the people that worked on the project. You mentioned, I think, Brett, maybe as somebody on the mechanical side of things, but from your perspective and your experience, what made this project special from a people perspective?
Well, I think it was the multidiscipline. So I also got to work with Jill Davis. She was the PM for this project, and Jill and I went to UMaine together and graduated, and I think this was one of our first projects where she was the project manager and I was kind of the lead engineer working with her. So that
Cool.
was fun in itself as well. And then also getting to work with Brett. I've worked with him on a lot of other projects, but in this was a slightly different capacity of working with him
Hmm.
from an engineering standpoint. So that was the part I enjoyed the most. They were folks I'd worked with but hadn't collaborated in the design process with.
Sure. What was your experience working with the client on this project?
It was good. A lot of our collaboration was done within our team, and a lot of communication went through Jill as the PM,
Okay.
but um, We did have team calls and it went well working with the client. No issues there.
Okay. Yeah, that's the reason I bring it up is one of the really cool things about working in the hydropower industry is I guess the variation in amount of client input on some of these technical designs that sometimes occurs. You have clients that really kind of stay hands off and just communicate through the project manager and let the technical team do what they do best. You have other clients that do maybe have some technical background and are actually assisting in the design or providing some ideas and prompts. So I really like that aspect of the industry that every client's a little bit different in terms of how they want to handle being involved in a project. There's no pros or cons to either way, but it does make kind of working on projects like this interesting. So I don't has that been your experience as well?
Yes. Yeah. And for this one, the client was great because we would get to a point where in the design and we would have to ask a little bit more clarification. They weren't really in the design work, but we would explain like the inlet configuration and talking with them about that. They had the site presence and more expertise to talk through what was actually happening out there, and they were able to provide that input and kind of guidance of, oh, this is how we think it's actually going to go.
Hmm.
So they were really supportive that way for this project.
Gotcha. Okay. Very, very cool. Um, let's transition over to kind of some lessons learned from the project. So, what would you say, in thinking back at your experience, what lessons did this project teach you that others in the industry could learn from?
Probably the first one is thinking outside the box, which I know we hear a lot about. Don't just say this is the only way or this is the way we've done it in the past. We should only do it this way. While a siphon is not a new thing, I think the application of the size of the siphon that we designed here was something new, and so
Mm,
that was a little bit more unique
mhm.
to do that. So I think that was a good lessons learned um, from this project.
Yeah. Would there be anything that you would do differently next time?
I think a little more um, work confirming with the contractor of the operations, just because these systems can be finicky. Just working with the client to understand that a little bit more might be a good um, addition to the design process.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Um, okay, what about looking forward? Obviously, this is the type of project that Kleinschmidt has done in the past that we, hope to continue to do in the future. From your perspective, why should a client hire Kleinschmidt for a project like this?
Well, I think the part that spoke to me the most, and I think would for clients, is our ability to support all the different areas of the project. So we had a multidiscipline team that was supporting this from engineering perspective. And while it wasn't necessarily part of the design process, I know Jill had been working with the regulatory side to get us into this spot in advance of the work going on. So I think the fact that we can bring that expertise to a client as a single team
Mm.
is a great thing for people to know about and contact us about.
Yeah, and looking back at, the decision to do a siphon here as opposed to other bypass mechanisms, were there any, I guess, specific benefits to the project, to the owner, to the environment that the siphon had over alternative approaches?
The big thing was the cost and environmental impacts by using the siphon because we were able to use an HDPE pipe
Hmm.
that allowed more flexibility rather than like a steel pipe. So we were able to use the grade at the project. And there were some areas that we had to do some excavation and earthwork, but that was fairly limited. in comparison to something more significant from a structure standpoint. So we were able to reduce that impact, which reduces impact to the environment as well as cost.
Yeah. As far as you know, is the project as designed still functioning?
As far as I know, yep.
Very cool. That's awesome. Also, one of the cool things about working in Hydro, right, is having projects lead to stuff that gets built that sticks around for a while, and you can kind of go look at or check in on, and I love that part of our job too. Looking back, what would you say you are most proud of when it comes to this project?
This project, probably the, I'd say even initial step up to say, sure, I'll help with this. Like I said, I hadn't been involved with this type of design prior to doing it. So there was a little bit of excitement, but also fear because I was like, oh, I haven't done this. But we had a great team around us that I felt comfortable with using our resources internally, using those folks that had done it in the past to work and learn from. So probably that initial getting outside my comfort zone to really grow as an engineer was the part I was most proud of.
That's awesome. I am going to ask you one more question that's maybe more of a 10,000-foot level question. And I'm curious to get your perspective on this, especially given your role as technical director of our science division. What would you say, there's obviously a lot of really cool stuff right now going on in hydro. What would you say excites you most about kind of the future of hydropower and where things are currently going?
Oh, probably the amount of opportunity that
Hmm.
out there and the variety. So I think with our job, it's amazing that we can be doing lots of projects, working on lots of projects at hydro facilities, but doing something completely different every
Sure.
day.
Yeah.
So I think the sheer breadth of opportunities that we have is the most exciting. Um, and the fact that the hydro industry is really, this sounds so cliche, but it's helping make the world a better place. And we are a part of that, whether it's improving the longevity of the structures, if it's improving the water quality, the habitat for the fish and aquatics, of all of those things are contributing to make the world better. And I just think it's really exciting.
Yeah, well, that's perfect. That's a perfect way to close out our episode today. Jennifer Jones, thank you so much for sharing the story behind this hydropower bypass siphon design and the work that your team did on that. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Making Waves. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with a colleague, a client, or a friend. Join us next time as we continue to highlight the projects and the people that make Kleinschmidt so special. Jennifer, thanks for coming on. Really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben.
Until next time.